Hey Slate listeners, I'm Christina Cauterucci, the host of Slow Burn, Gays Against Briggs. I want to tell you about a special event we're doing at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City on June 13th. To celebrate the new season of Slow Burn and Pride Month, we'll be hosting an exclusive taping of the show with special guests including Eric Marcus, the host of Making Gay History. We'll dive deeper into this season and talk about the lasting impact of the Briggs Initiative and the continued fight over LGBTQ rights in schools. Plus, we'll share some behind-the-scenes stories and never-before-aired tape from this season. It'll be the perfect way to celebrate Pride Month this June, with LGBTQ stories and voices across generations. You won't want to miss it. Again, that's June 13th at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. You can get tickets now at tribecafilm.com/slowburn. Hope to see you there.
If there's anything I did to reduce my own loneliness, it was understanding how universal it is and how extraordinary the capacity for misunderstanding is around loneliness and around what we need from each other.
Welcome to How To. I'm Courtney Martin. We're living in a moment of paradox. Right now, we're the most connected we've ever been. And yet, rates of loneliness are dangerously high. According to a recent poll from the American Psychiatric Association, 30% of adults in the United States report feeling lonely at least once a week. 10% report feeling lonely every single day. So here's this human experience that's so common. I mean, we've all been lonely at some point in our lives, right? Even if just briefly. And yet, it's hard for us to even articulate what loneliness looks and feels like. I'll tell you that for me, loneliness has this quality of, I can only describe it as kind of like mistranslation. It's as if I'm saying something and no one can understand me. I can be surrounded by people I love, and it's like I'm speaking a different language. It's kind of devastating, even when the scene itself is totally mundane, an extended family dinner party or just a day in my life where all the wires get crossed. But is that what loneliness feels like to you? I really have no idea. However it manifests, it's an experience that is simultaneously isolating and universal. It can also leave us wondering where to turn. Which brings us to today's listener.
My name is Paula. I'm a lawyer by profession. I work in civil court cases. I work in activism and LGBTQI issues and sexual and reproductive rights in my country.
Paula grew up in a big family in Costa Rica, and she sees them frequently for celebrations or even just trips to the beach. She's 29 years old and has two nice groups of friends. One she's known since childhood, and one she met through her activism. Paula also has a girlfriend she adores. She even goes to a weekly pottery class. Lovely, right? But Paula says she's felt lonely for as long as she can remember. She enjoys solitude and spending time by herself, but this is different. It's like something deep inside that never really goes away. Paula recently sent us this beautiful question. How should I deal with the loneliness I've felt for most of my life? This is how she described it in her message.
All of my life, I've struggled to form close bonds and relationships. I've followed every tip on how to make friends and evolve those friendships. But I feel like there is always an invisible barrier between me and people. And because of that, it is very difficult for me to be comfortable, be myself, and open up to others, even if they've been vulnerable with me. I know that I have friends and family that love me, but I still don't feel like we have a deep personal connection. Except for my girlfriend, but I don't like the idea of her being the only person I feel connected to. So, how do I deal with the feeling of loneliness? How do I make peace with it?
Paula, if you were to explain the feeling of loneliness to like a kid who'd never experienced it or like an alien from another planet, how would you describe it? What does it actually feel like to you?
I would say it feels like wanting to connect or wanting to rely on someone, but not knowing on who to rely on or not being able to do so.
Okay. So that like a gap between you and others and a not knowing in that gap of like who to reach out to, how to reach out. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds perfect.
You mentioned feeling lonely your whole life. And I'm wondering, has the texture of it changed over time? Like, did, 7-year-old Paula feel loneliness different than 29-year-old Paula, or is it the same quality?
I think it has changed a lot throughout my life. When I was a child, I knew I was lonely, but I don't know if I could name it back then.
Mm-hmm.
But when I was a teenager, it was like a really deep and very sad loneliness. My teenage years, I now know I was very depressed, and in huge part, it was the feeling of loneliness that prompted it.
And when is the time in your life when you felt the least alone?
For me, it's interesting because it started when I came out of the closet. I think something shifted in the way that I connected with people and maybe saw myself more clearly. I don't think this feeling of loneliness is the same. It's not as deep and overwhelming as it was before.
There's a vulnerability in admitting that you're lonely. You don't have to be at absolute zero to feel shame around not getting the level of connection you crave. From a very young age, we've been taught that to be lonely means that you're flawed. There's a reason people don't want to be around you. That narrative is very hard to break once it's wormed its way in. But of course, loneliness is one of the most universal things any person can feel. Which is why we're bringing in someone who spent years looking at loneliness with the careful attention of an artist.
My name's Kristen Radtke. I'm a writer, illustrator, and creative director. My most recent book was called Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness.
Seek You is this beautiful graphic novel that looks at the scientific and cultural reasons why we're lonely and what can be done to feel more connected. We'll hear about what sparked that project and talk with Kristen and Paula after this break. This episode is brought to you by Z-Biotics. There's now a game-changing product to use before a night out with drinks. It's called Z-Biotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. Z-Biotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. Z-Biotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Z-Biotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make Z-Biotics your first drink of the night, then drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/howto to get 15% off your first order when you use howto at checkout. Z-Biotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/howto and use the code howto at checkout for 15% off. You know that's the sound of another sale on your online Shopify store, but did you know Shopify powers selling in person too? That's right, Shopify is the sound of selling everywhere, online, in store, on social media, and beyond. Listen, I spent last Sunday with my daughter as she tried to sell homemade earrings at a school festival. Face-to-face sales, hand-to-hand cash transactions, it was chaos. And I thought to myself, boy, this would have been so much easier with Shopify. Shopify POS is your command center for your retail store. From accepting payments to managing inventory, Shopify has everything you need to sell in person. With Shopify, you get a powerhouse selling partner that effortlessly unites your in-person and online sales into one source of truth. Track every sale across your business in one place and know exactly what's in stock. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/howto, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/howto to take your retail business to the next level today. Shopify.com/howto. Kristen, let's hear a little bit of your story, like what role loneliness has played in your life. Maybe a good place to start is to try to define this thing that can be really hard to define, right?
Yeah, so the way I describe loneliness is the gap between the relationships you have and the relationships you want. I think that's a really simple version of basically what the science of loneliness says. In terms of my own loneliness, I think it's probably why I started writing the book. I started writing it in 2016. I was actually 29 at the time, which is, Paula, the moment you're in right now is actually statistically one of the loneliest periods of our lives. Our loneliness spikes in our late 20s, our mid 50s, and then all of our 80s. And if you think about those times, they're moments usually of transition. Like in your late 20s, you're really kind of like settling into adulthood, figuring out what your life is, figuring out who's important to you. You know, in your mid 50s, maybe if you had children, they're leaving the house, or maybe you're edging closer towards retirement. And in your 80s, you know, your mobility might be limited. People you love might be, you know, lost. I relate to the period that you're in. It was definitely, my late 20s was one of my loneliest periods. And so I started just reading about loneliness and trying to understand it, reading about the science of loneliness. And then from there, I just became kind of obsessed with it. And the book sort of came from there.
Kristen, what are you hearing in what Paula's describing? Any initial reactions?
Well, I think it's a really common feeling. I mean, I think it's really frustrating to feel like I have the people in my life that I need. I have a family that loves me. I have friends that love me. I have a partner that loves me. Why am I still feeling isolated? You mentioned really liking time alone. And there is a really big difference between solitude and loneliness. And it sounds like you really enjoy your solitude, which is wonderful, but you're also experiencing loneliness. So it's kind of this double-edged thing. And it sounds like, Paula, correct me if I'm wrong, do you feel most lonely when you're by yourself or when you're with other people?
I think I tend to feel lonely after I hang out.
Interesting. There's the cliche about feeling alone in a crowd. And I think one of the really important things when we're trying to understand loneliness is that we have to separate it from the concept that ending loneliness is just about spending time with other people, because it's not. It's about spending time with people that we feel fulfilled by, that we feel challenged by, loved by, that we have a really deep connection with. And one of the things you mentioned, Paula, was you're talking about your girlfriend and you feel comfortable with her, but you don't want her to be the only one. I think that's really wonderful thing to recognize. I think culturally, like in sort of like the rom-com era, we were kind of conditioned to believe that once we find a partner, that was sort of the solution to all of our problems. And suddenly we would feel fulfilled and that would be it. But that's really not the case.
I've actually talked with her and she knows how I feel. And I think it's nice that she can be with me through that feeling.
Yeah.
I want to pause on this insight. Too often, when people are lonely, we tell them, just put yourself out there. So often, that's actually not the solution. More human contact won't magically solve loneliness. Listen, in order to feel connected with others, we have to spend quality time together. Now, we'll talk about how to make connections more fulfilling, whether you have or don't have a variety of friends like Paula. But for now, it's worth asking if certain people have more of a propensity for feeling lonely.
So everybody has a different threshold for the time that they can spend alone, and everyone has a different threshold for how much time they can spend with other people. And then everyone has kind of a different internal barometer about how likely they are to feel loneliness. Like we can kind of think about it a little bit like I'm an extrovert or I'm an introvert, but it's a lot more complicated than that. You know, you can be an extrovert who's very active and still feel quite lonely. And I feel like that's one of the things we have to push against is the idea that all you have to do is take a pottery class and then your loneliness will be ended because you're surrounded by people. And that's really not the case. I think the hardest part for me about, writing the book was that in the end, I don't necessarily have a magic solution to end loneliness. I mean, that was really, I think in a certain way, that's what I was writing towards, was the hope that I would find some solution. But there's really not a clear-cut answer to how to solve loneliness. I mean, Paula, all the things you're doing, talking about your loneliness with people close to you, attending classes, like being active, like these are all steps we can take to ease loneliness, but it doesn't automatically solve the problem.
How does that feel to hear?
Which is really frustrating.
Yeah, I was
it's really frustrating.
Paula, how does that feel to hear?
It feels frustrating, but at the same time validating because, as I said in the email, I've been trying all these tips and tricks to solve loneliness and they haven't worked. So I feel better knowing that it isn't a me thing. and it's just a fact of life.
Yeah. And then I guess part of the question,
thing,
Kristen, is like, what level of loneliness is like existential and totally natural and, you know, just part of life? And then when does it get to a place where it's actually dangerous and like you're really suffering, you know? Also, like, how much of this is about being understood? That word just keeps coming up for me, Kristen and Paula, that like, it's one thing to be around other people and to be cared for and, you know, to be in relationship. It's another to feel actually understood by other people, which I think is far more rare. Like, Paula, do you think that's part of your craving, is to be understood in a different way?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, it's this great question. I think so much of it has to do with vocalizing that feeling. You know, I think so you asked earlier about when does loneliness become dangerous? And so basically when we feel lonely for a really long period of time, our bodies and brains can actually enter a state that's called hypervigilance. And that's where we start to assume that we'll get rejected or hurt by other people before that rejection actually takes place. So that's when we start to self-isolate. That's when we say, oh, I'm not going to call my friend. She doesn't want to hang out with me anyway. Like, I said something stupid the last time we were together. I'm too embarrassed to see her again, or she'll never understand how I feel. I'm not going to reach out. I'm not going to share. And that gets to a point where then we can actually inhibit our ability to make new connections. So that's a really dangerous place to be.
Author Olivia Lang explained it like this. As loneliness rises, someone becomes less adept at navigating social currents. It's almost like mold that grows on you. You not only feel shame about the mold, but it makes future interactions harder because you feel anxiety about the mold. So you don't attempt to interact with someone in order to protect yourself. And meanwhile, you feel worse, and the mold just grows thicker, perpetuating the problem.
And that's, I think, where we have to work to fight our natural instincts, because our natural instincts when we feel lonely, when we feel isolated, is to isolate further. Is not to make the phone call, is not to set the coffee date, it's not to reach out, it's not to admit the feeling that we have. And part of that is, I think, we can feel kind of ashamed for feeling lonely, like there's something wrong with us, which is something I think we really need to fight against. So I think generally my main advice when someone wants to be understood, when someone is feeling a sense of isolation, is that the most important thing you can do is work on how you can communicate that. You know, like if there's a way in which you feel understood, is there something about the way you're communicating? Not to say that there's something you're doing wrong, but that there's something else you could try in order to feel more understood. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, like just trying to be more openly yourself and yourself in a way that others can understand or get close to understanding.
Yeah, or like even expressing a desire to be understood. I mean, I think, you know, we're all so busy and we're all, you know, we have all of these commitments, et cetera, et cetera. And I think sometimes we can't necessarily recognize someone else's desire for connection. We might be feeling exactly the same way.
Recently, I've been noticing I do something, which is I ask my friends a lot of questions about whatever they're talking about or whatever is going on in their lives. So there's not as much of a focus on me, and I don't have to open up. I have this issue with being perceived, I call it. So I feel if the attention is on me, I'm being perceived way too much. And I feel very uncomfortable in that situation.
You don't like a lot of attention?
No, which is interesting because I like, for example, for me, personal style is very, very important as a way of expressing yourself. And I really like to dress very bright and colorful and maximalist clothing. So I find there's this contradiction between how I like to dress and present it to the world versus how I talk more about my feelings, more about how I'm feeling or who I am with people.
That's really interesting. Because in one version, you're not necessarily having to speak. Like, you're not necessarily having to share things.
Yeah, it's more non-verbal communication.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it was making me think of sort of the limitations of language, right? That, like, it is really hard to describe an inner state that we have. And like, it's hard to be understood. It's hard to even understand ourselves, right? And to like wrap words around what our experience of the world is. But you are a lawyer, right? You're like a very verbal person, I would guess. Like you're trained in a very verbal art.
So legal system here is different than the one in the US, and it's mainly written. So I've positioned myself in my work as the person who prepares the written arguments or makes the memo if you have to go to trial. And my coworkers know that I don't enjoy speaking in public as much. But when I had to do it in college, for me, it was like I was in a character. It gives me so much anxiety to speak in public that I had to almost pretend I'm somebody else who doesn't have anxiety, and it's good. And I prepare a lot. I practice. I make summaries whenever I have to talk in public because it's very nerve-wracking for me.
Does that character have a name, Paula?
Not really. It's like, oh, there's my party personality. There's my work personality, my academic personality. It's just like, oh, this costumes I take and put on and take off whenever I need to.
Ooh. This seems like one of those things, Kristen, that is very adaptable and like brilliant that Paula figured out, but maybe is now harming her because she's gotten...
Yeah.
You think?
Yeah, it's like both things. I mean, it makes total sense to say, like, in these public arenas, I'm going to play this part as a way to not be nervous or anxious. I relate to that a lot. The question is, though, do you feel like you are playing a part when you're interacting interpersonally as well?
I sometimes do, and sometimes I'm very conscious on not doing it. But very quickly I feel like, oh, this interaction is not going well. I'm going to go back to my friend character. So I think that's part of why connecting with people is so difficult for me.
Do you feel that same difficulty in written communication? You mentioned that you write a lot for your job. Like if you're texting a friend or something like that, do you feel that same level of discomfort, or is it just in person?
No, it's just in person. It's way easier for me to text my friends and talk about things via text.
So that's very compelling. One of the questions I kept getting after I wrote this book was, talk about social media. Tell us about how social media is bad. Tell us about how internet and technology is separating us from one another. And I really struggled with that argument because, while I do think that there are risks associated with social media, like the fact that, people who spend more time on Instagram are more likely to be depressed, things like that. There's all these studies that say it messes with our self-esteem, whatever. But I also have a lot of people in my life who feel very connected to other people through their phones, through texting. I mean, that is a really valuable form of communication. So I wouldn't undercut the value of that, Paula, if that feels good to you. I mean, I think you can definitely, that's a space in which you can be vulnerable and perhaps feel some abatement to that feeling of isolation or loneliness.
Yeah, definitely. It helps. When I talk via text with my friends, it makes me feel sometimes closer to them. And actually, I think that's how I formed my friend group. We were initially just a group chat to go eat wings after classes.
Funny.
I love it.
I think the group chat is a really important part of our social lives in this period.
I also love the idea of a headline being like, solution to loneliness, wings.
Group chats. Yeah,
group
wings.
Chats,
yeah.
Group chats and wings.
Yeah.
Okay, so wings aside, there's a good lesson here. Don't turn up your nose at certain types of connection just because society doesn't deem them as good. There is a lot of community and connection to be found with a Discord server, a group chat, or even via voicemails passed back and forth if there's shared care. Find what makes you feel truly known and work it into your life. When we come back, how to sit with discomfort and resist putting on a character. Don't go anywhere. Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. It's real cash that never expires or loses value. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch, subject to credit approval. Daily cash is available via Apple Cash Card issued by Green Dot Bank, member FDIC, or as a statement credit. Terms and more at applecard.com. Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. It's real cash that never expires or loses value. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch, subject to credit approval. Daily cash is available via Apple Cash Card issued by Green Dot Bank, member FDIC, or as a statement credit. Terms and more at applecard.com. This episode is brought to you by Defender. For those who embrace the impossible, the Defender 110 is up for the adventure. This iconic vehicle has been redefined with thoroughly modern design. The exterior is reimagined with compelling proportions and precise detailing, and the interior is built with robust materials and integrity. The Defender capability is legendary, whether you're facing off-road challenges or harsh weather conditions. Built for the modern explorer, the Defender 110 lets you go further and do more. And cargo capacity means more room for your gear. Innovative camera technologies deliver unobstructed views and effortless maneuvering. Ready for a wide range of adventures, the Defender family features the two-door Defender 90, the Defender 110, and the Defender 130, which seats up to 8. A vehicle made to go further, the Defender 110. Learn more at LandRoverUSA.com/Defender. We're back with Kristen Radtke, the author of Seek You, A Journey Through American Loneliness, and Paula, our listener who wants to feel less lonely and make more satisfying connections with other people. I did want to go back to what you were saying about the friend character, Paula, because you were saying, like, when things aren't going well, as you perceive them, you'll think, okay, I'm going to go kind of back into the friend character, whether that's explicit or sort of more subconscious. And I was thinking, Kristen, do you think one of the problems is that we might have this perception that connection is supposed to be comfortable? So then when we get uncomfortable, we either go into some kind of like Irvin Goffman like role, like Paula's describing, or we like disconnect, right? We like literally go away. Whereas the truth of connection is that it's often uncomfortable if you're being authentic. And so like maybe part of being less lonely is tolerating the discomfort of those kinds of moments instead of going into the character.
You know, it's funny you say that because my therapist is always like, what would happen if you sat with that discomfort? And I'm always like, I don't want to be uncomfortable. It
No,
sucks.
thanks.
It's the worst.
And my therapist is always like, what happens if you change your routine? I'm like, why would I?
Yeah. And like, I do things the way I want to, and it's fine. I don't have like the magic solution there to like, how do you sit with that discomfort? How do you push past it? I mean, I was raised in the Midwest, which is a place that is very conflict averse. I have friends who were raised on the East Coast and are completely opposite, and they like argue for fun. And I feel really overwhelmed by that. And I often then retreat into myself, which is something I have to actively fight against. And it's something I'm still working on because I'm so afraid that like, oh, what if someone gets mad at me if I disagree with them or something like that, which is just a fear of probably like abandonment or loneliness. So I think that's a great point, Courtney, about what does it mean for us to not be comfortable in every interaction?
Yeah. I also wonder, Paula, if you could, or if you maybe have tried this, but name this with friends. I happen to be the same way, surprise, surprise, because I host a podcast where I ask people questions. But I like in many relationships, I will just ask people 1,000 questions. And then they're like, we didn't even talk about you. And I'm like, oh, that's fine. So I really relate to that. And I think one thing I could imagine doing is saying to a friend, hey, I'm trying to work on this. Like, I genuinely love asking people questions. And I'm inquisitive and that's authentic. But I also think I sometimes use it as this crutch to not open up. So can you call me out on it? Like if you notice me doing it, or just try to help me have a more balanced back and forth. Have you ever thought about doing that with friends?
No, I hadn't thought about it, but it's a very good idea. I think there's a couple of friends I would feel comfortable enough to do that.
Yeah. I mean, as I'm saying it, I'm like, I don't want to do that. Why would you want to do that?
Yeah, like it sounds awful.
That's terrible. Yeah, I mean, what is, at a deep level, Kristen, what is this fear of being open and exposed?
There's all kinds of things I think that we could talk about in relationship to vulnerability. I mean, being vulnerable is scary. Friendship is frightening because in order to be close friends with someone, you're confiding in them, which means you're handing them information that can harm you in the future. If you tell someone a secret, if you confide about something painful, and then that is not held in confidence. I mean, it's a real leap of faith when we share in that way. And so I think that it's natural to feel discomfort in those environments because biologically, your brain is trying to protect you.
Yeah.
So I think it's a part of it. This is just about trust that they're not going to harm you, or understanding that if they harm you, that's also like that kind of pain is something we need to experience and we need to go through, and we learn from those experiences.
My friends and I actually use this phrase we call a vulnerability hangover. It's when you say a little more than you were comfortable saying the night before. It's like sore muscles, a sign that you pushed yourself past your comfort zone. Now, in this exercise of connection, it's helpful to step back and remember that loneliness and solitude are different, and you don't have to forgo solitude in order to be less lonely.
Time spent alone is not the same thing as feeling lonely. Paula, you mentioned like enjoying your solitude. Like that's wonderful. The poet and essayist Maggie Nelson has this line in her book Bluets, which is loneliness is solitude with a problem, which I think is hilarious. And while it's not necessarily like a complete definition, because loneliness and solitude are not necessarily tied, I do find that I enjoy my aloneness much more when I feel fulfilled, when I'm like engaged in a creative project, when I feel like my sort of intellectual and emotional needs are met. Then being alone for me is like a really welcomed space and relief. And I think that's difficult if I'm feeling, unsatisfied, if I'm feeling like frustrated with a project that I'm working on that I can't figure out, if I feel like I just, I had a fight with my friend, things like that. Suddenly being alone is a lot trickier for me.
I love that. Paula, what about you? How do you experience solitude?
It's very similar to what Kristen described. I really like reading, doing pottery. I've gotten to the point where I have my own materials and tools at home, and also just like sketching things I want to do. But most of my hobbies are alone hobbies. So I think for me, alone time, it's very recharging because I'm doing things I really love.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I was also thinking when you both were describing it that maybe in the same way we were talking about loneliness as a space of not being understood by others, solitude is often a practice of understanding ourselves.
Yes, I think so. I think that there is only so much we can learn about ourselves in isolation, but I think there's also only so much we can learn about ourselves when we're with other people. I think figuring out that balance for yourself and respecting and honoring the time both for yourself and with others is really kind of an important formula we all have to figure out.
Paula, do you feel like you understand that formula for yourself?
No. I think it's very easy for me to just do things by myself. Like, I don't know, simple things like if I want to run, I have to run some errands or things that I think, it would be nice to have someone with me through this day. But most of the times I think, it's going to be so tiring to have to interact with someone that it's best if I just do this by myself.
That's interesting. So to me, when I think about the like marker of a really close friend, like a really trusted friend, is someone I can just call to say, hey, I've got to run this errand. Will you come do this thing with me? Like, is there a way you can find, a path to feeling comfortable, not feeling like you have to work so hard with other people?
Yeah, I think that definitely would help. I think that's what I'm working towards.
It also depends on the people, right? Like I have friends that I can read in silence with. Like we would just sit together and read, and that's like both of our fantasies for being with our friends.
It's so
and then
fun.
there are other people who are like way verbal, and like that would be torture. So I also have a sense in my own life of kind of a taxonomy of my friends and who can spend time in different ways and what mood am I in around that. So Paula, I wonder about that. Like, do you feel like you have a variety of people in your life and you know what they're capable of in terms of like being non-performative or even non-verbal sometimes?
Oh yeah, I do. I was talking to my therapist about this last week, actually, and I was like, oh yeah, if this friend and this friend are going, I feel more comfortable going because I know they are going to take over the space and make sure everyone's good and talking, and they're very good with other people. So I feel less pressured to like host or to put it in some way. So I know I have the friends I know that are good for some things and good for other things. And I try to, I don't know, set up groups and hang out space on that.
It also sounds, Paula, like you really take care of people. Like the way you just said that, I was like, wow, she's like really thinking a lot about everybody else's like comfort and maybe even entertainment. Does that resonate? And do you feel that you know how to be taken care of socially?
I do think a lot about people. I'm actually a great gift giver. And I think it's because of that. Like I'm always listening. What do you like? Or if you show me something you think it's cool, I'll make like a folder in my head and, oh, when it's your birthday, I'm buying you that. But I don't think I let myself be taken care of. Last week, like 2 weeks ago, I was sick and my girlfriend was taking me to the clinic and I felt very uncomfortable. I was like, oh no, I wanted my mom to do it because I don't know, it's my mom, it's easier. But she offered and she was okay. She wasn't mad or tired or annoyed because it took a long time, but I felt very uncomfortable.
What were you afraid of something in that scenario?
Oh, I think I was afraid of her being bored or wanting to go home, and her thinking like, oh, I'm here just because of Paula, and when I could be doing something else.
So it's like a fear of like abandonment or rejection.
Yeah.
I mean, I relate to that a lot. I'm also an excellent gift giver, so I relate to that quite a bit.
I love this. I'm like, I wish I was your two friends so you could give me gifts. But I do think when we get into these kinds of imbalances, when we like don't want to be an inconvenience to others, partly we're forgetting that it's a gift to others to feel like they can show up for you. You know, it makes them feel good about themselves in the same way it makes you feel good that you're a good gift giver, right? Like that's part of your identity and you pride yourself on it. Like I could hear it in your voice. So when you strip other people of that opportunity, including like your girlfriend, like your person, it's like you don't give them the chance to feel good about it. You know what I mean, Paula?
Yeah, that's a very good perspective I didn't have.
I want to talk a little bit about, I feel like, Paula, you're actually a little bit unusual in that you have this like beautifully designed life with all these great connections and, you know, the pottery class and the meaningful work and all these great things. And I know there will be listeners who feel lonely, who don't have those things, right? Like there's a lot of people out there who are really struggling to like find love, find a job that's meaningful, find community. So Kristen, will you just say a little bit about that? Like for people who are lonely and they really don't feel connected to others at all, like what are the first steps? Like what can they think about doing to get more connected?
So I do think the first step is finding common interests with other people. And I know that sounds like really basic and frustrating, like, oh, I'll just join the local rec center and take a swim class and then everything will be better, which is not true. It is much more complicated than that. But I do think it is a good start. Is there someone we have fallen out of touch with, who we miss, who we love, who we want to rekindle with? Like, I think that's a really great start, like someone who knows us well, or even knows a version of ourselves from before, even if we've fallen out of touch. I think that can be really, really valuable. And I also think it's about not overlooking what we do have. You know, it's this really tragic thing where there's all these studies, particularly in America, I'm not sure about globally, but every year that these surveys are done, Americans say they have fewer people they can talk to, fewer people they can trust, fewer people they can talk to about things that are important or that matter. So I think it's also about challenging ourselves to try. It's kind of like what I was saying earlier to Paula about, you know, what would happen if I shared something vulnerable and that trust was broken? Probably you'd be hurt, but you would survive and you would be less afraid of the bad thing happening because the bad thing did happen. And so I think it's about reducing that fear or saying I'm willing to confront that fear.
Here's the thing. reducing fear, confronting fear, being vulnerable, none of that is easy. But it's worth remembering a couple of things. First, loneliness isn't something to shame yourself over. It's not a scar you need to hide or mold you need to scrub away. It's a signal you can act on. And two, human contact isn't the only way to feel community. You can feel communion through nature, art, eavesdropping on the bus, anything that helps you move beyond the swirl of your own mind. Kristen, I want to talk a little bit about art, because one of the things that's so cool about your work is both the art you bring to your work and the way you actually use visual art to describe loneliness and solitude, but also that one can take comfort in art, that like one of the solutions to loneliness might be art. So could you talk a little bit about first your own work and like what was it like to bring a visual language to loneliness, and then also the way you think about art and solitude intermingling?
Well, when I was drawing the book, it was like there were some practical considerations where I was like, how am I going to show loneliness here without just like showing a person alone in an empty room again? Like there were like all of these questions that, but it caused me to think about loneliness, I think, in a different way, because I kind of had to move past the stock representations of loneliness in order to fill, a 300 or 400 page book. Like it was just a necessity. So I think actually the visual language was very helpful to me to understanding loneliness more holistically. And I do think that it is very common to find companionship in art or a reduction in the feelings of solitude in art. And I find that when I'm trying to find a solution to a problem or when I'm asking a question and I'm doing research, I'm kind of constantly coming back to art. It's not even intentionally. It feels like it's what pops up.
Do you find comfort in art, Paula?
Yeah. All of my life, when I was little, I painted. I was in a mural program, and pottery now for me feels like the perfect transition. I love that as a medium, and I really, really feel like it has allowed my creativity to explode, which was something that I had lost somewhere along the way. So I feel very happy to be creative again.
That's so great.
That's cool.
Kristen, do you remember a moment, you said that illustrating the book helped you have a more holistic idea about loneliness, and it made me wonder if there was ever a moment when a drawing like unlocked some different understanding of it for you. Like, can you remember any specific drawing that you did?
It's a great question. There was this one series in the book where I was drawing people floating in water, and I just wanted to draw that environment. I don't know why. I really wanted to draw a deep blue. I really wanted to draw a bunch of bubbles and figures. I was just kind of compelled by this image. And then as I was drawing it, I was kind of realizing oh yeah, loneliness to me feels kind of like being underwater. It reduces my ability to move quickly. It amplifies my own sensations and drowns out all the sounds around me. I think about being underwater and sound just feels different. And you just feel more separate from other people, even if there's other people maybe swimming near you in the pool. So I think that was an instance in which just my desire to draw something did actually bring me to kind of a new metaphor or way of understanding that sensation.
That's amazing. It immediately reminds me of being a little girl myself, or watching, I have 2 young daughters, play Tea Party underwater. Did you guys ever play that as a kid, where you go under cute, and try to talk, but you can't understand what the other person is saying? So it is very much like we're talking about, that loneliness is this feeling of being with people but not being understood. You do that on purpose, right? As a kid. Interesting. Thanks to Paula for sharing her story with us, and to Kristen Radtke for all of her useful advice. Pick up a copy of Seek You to see her beautiful illustrations. Do you have a paradox that needs parsing? Send us a note at howto@slate.com or leave us a voicemail at 646-495-4001, and we might have you on the show. And if you like what you heard today, please give us a rating and a review and tell a friend. That helps us help more people. How To is produced by Rosemary Belson with Kevin Bendis. Joel Meyer is senior editor, and Derek John is executive producer. Merritt Jacob is senior technical director and composed our theme music. Charles Duhigg created the show. Carvel Wallace is my co-host, and I'm Courtney Martin. Thanks for listening.